What if some of the most powerful Vikings in history were not Scandinavian at all? For more than a century, historians believed the Viking conquest of Scotland was a story of invasion, replacement, and disappearance. But archaeology and DNA now tell a very different story, one that forces us to rethink who the Vikings were, how they spread, and what it truly meant to become one. When Viking ships first appeared along the coasts of northern Britain in the late 8th century, they did not arrive in an empty land, nor one waiting to be conquered. The Northern Isles of Scotland were already home to the Picts, a society shaped by generations of adaptation to a harsh maritime world. These were people who understood the sea not as a barrier, but as a highway. They navigated complex tidal systems. They anticipated sudden storms. They knew the narrow channels between islands where ships could vanish or be trapped and destroyed. Their settlements were not scattered or accidental. They were fortified, carefully placed, and connected through regional trade networks that linked the islands to mainland Britain and beyond. Stone-built strongholds rose from headlands. Harbors were chosen with intention. This was a landscape long mastered by human knowledge. When the Vikings arrived, they entered a system that already worked. What they brought was not simply violence. It was a new way of organizing power, one based on mobility, seasonal raiding, tribute extraction, and long-distance exchange. It rewarded speed, adaptability, and local intelligence. And for the people who already lived there, the arrival of the Vikings was not merely a threat, it was a moment of decision. For more than a century, archaeology relied on a rule that felt both logical and unshakable. Objects were treated as identities. If a grave contained a Scandinavian sword, the person buried there was assumed to be Scandinavian. If the burial followed Norse customs, the individual was labeled a Viking. Boat graves were read as Norwegian families. Oval brooches were taken as proof of Viking women. Longhouses were interpreted as evidence of settlers arriving from across the North Sea. This framework was not careless. It was the best system scholars had in an era when material culture was the primary source of evidence. Artifacts were durable. Bones were silent. Identity had to be inferred. Over time, the assumption hardened into certainty. Museum displays arranged artifacts and people as one and the same. Textbooks built timelines that equated Norse objects with Norse migration. Documentaries repeated the story until it felt self-evident. And from that logic came a conclusion that shaped an entire historical narrative. The Picts, it was said, disappeared under Viking pressure. They were replaced, displaced, or absorbed, and then lost to history. Few questioned this interpretation, not because it was proven beyond doubt, but because there was no alternative method to challenge it. Until there was. That certainty began to unravel in the early years of the 21st century. New advances in ancient DNA sequencing made it possible to extract genetic material from human remains buried more than 1,000 years ago. For the first time, ancestry could be measured directly, not guessed from the objects placed beside the dead. Bones, long silent, began to speak. When researchers turned their attention to Viking-era graves in Orkney, the expectation was clear and reasonable. Graves identified as Viking would contain Scandinavian DNA. The artifacts demanded it. The burial rites confirmed it. The historical model depended on it. But the results did not cooperate. Burial after burial revealed individuals whose genetic profiles were overwhelmingly local. Their ancestry aligned not with Norway or Denmark, but with Iron Age populations of northern Britain. In statistical terms, they were indistinguishable from Pictish communities that had lived in the region for centuries. And yet, these same individuals were buried with Viking weapons, Viking dress fittings, and Viking ritual practices. They lay beneath the soil as Norse warriors in every visible sense. These were not mixed households. They were not the children of recent settlers. They were not exceptions on the margins. They were locals fully embedded in Viking culture and fully rooted in the land they had never left. One burial, more than any other, made the implications impossible to dismiss. The grave belonged to a middle-aged man laid to rest in the mid-10th century, at the height of Viking power in northern Britain. He was equipped exactly as a Norse warrior should be. A spear rested at his side, a knife lay near his hand, a sharpening stone accompanied his weapons, signaling a life shaped by combat and maintenance of steel. Among the grave goods was a silver coin minted during the Viking Age's most dominant phase, a precise chronological marker, leaving no doubt about the cultural moment. The burial followed Norse customs with careful precision. Nothing about it suggested uncertainty or imitation. This was not a hesitant adoption of Viking practice. It was confident, complete, and deliberate. Then the DNA was analyzed. Both his maternal and paternal lineages traced back to the British Isles, with no detectable Scandinavian ancestry. His genetic profile matched populations that had occupied the region since the Bronze Age. Generation after generation, his ancestors had lived and died on the same land. In the archaeological record, he was a Viking without question. In biological terms, he was not, and when the broader data was examined, it became clear this man was not an exception. He was the first unmistakable signal of a pattern no one had been prepared to see. As the genetic dataset expanded, any remaining doubt began to dissolve. What first appeared as a surprising outlier soon revealed itself as a consistent pattern. Across Orkney and the wider Northern Isles, individuals with clearly Pictish ancestry repeatedly appeared in Viking-era burials of high status. These were not modest graves at the edges of society. Many contained elaborate weapons, imported goods, and symbols of authority. In several cases, individuals with local genetic profiles were buried with richer grave assemblages than those whose DNA traced directly to Scandinavia. Status, it became clear, did not depend on birthplace. It depended on role, reputation, and belonging within the Viking social order. Some of these individuals occupied positions that suggested leadership, not subordination. Their burials reflected confidence and recognition, not imitation or uncertainty. Even more striking was where the pattern did not stop. Genetically local individuals also appeared in Viking burials within Scandinavia itself. People born outside the Norse world were not merely adopting Viking customs on the frontier. They were traveling, participating, and being laid to rest in the Viking heartland with honor. This was not assimilation confined to the edges of empire. It was acceptance at the core. This evidence forces a fundamental reassessment of how Viking power actually functioned. The image of vast Scandinavian armies sweeping across northern Britain collapses under closer scrutiny. Viking raiding groups were small, mobile, and efficient, but they were never numerous enough to occupy and control large territories through force alone. Permanent dominance requires population, logistics, and continuity resources the Vikings did not bring in sufficient quantity. What they required instead was cooperation. They needed local elites who understood the land, its coastlines, harbors, and seasonal rhythms. They needed warriors already adapted to the environment, capable of fighting alongside them rather than against them. And they needed families willing to adopt Norse law, dress, language, and identity, creating stability where conquest alone could not. Power, in this context, was not imposed, it was negotiated. The Viking system rewarded participation. It offered access to trade networks, protection, and opportunity. For those willing to join, the benefits could outweigh resistance. Seen through this lens, Viking success in Scotland no longer appears to be the result of mass migration or population replacement. It begins to look like something far more strategic, not conquest by numbers, but expansion through recruitment. For the Picts, adopting Viking identity was not an act of surrender. It was a strategy for survival. Faced with a new power structure that rewarded mobility, violence, and long-distance exchange, local leaders recognized that resistance alone offered limited prospects. By aligning themselves with Norse authority, they retained influence rather than losing it. Power changed hands, but it did not disappear. Families who adopted Norse customs gained more than protection. They gained access to trade networks that stretched across the North Atlantic. They gained security within a system that valued participation and loyalty. In a volatile world, Viking identity offered predictability. The most consequential choice, however, concerned the next generation. Children raised speaking Norse, learning Viking laws, and sailing on seasonal expeditions grew up without a sense of contradiction. To them, Viking culture was not foreign, it was normal. When they died, they were buried according to Norse rites, surrounded by Norse symbols. Within a single generation, the distinction between Pict and Viking blurred beyond recognition. The transformation was so complete that only DNA silent for centuries remembered a different origin. The transformation of society in Viking Age Scotland was not confined to warriors and elites. The burial record of women tells the same story. With equal clarity, across the Northern Isles, women with unmistakably local genetic ancestry were laid to rest following Scandinavian funerary traditions. They were buried with diagnostic Norse artifacts, including oval brooches that archaeologists long treated as definitive markers of Viking identity. These were not isolated cases. They formed a consistent pattern across generations. Their presence reveals something essential. Viking identity was not imposed solely through conquest. It was sustained through families. Children born into these households inherited Viking identity from birth. They learned Norse language and customs as their first cultural framework. For them, there was no transition to explain, no older identity to abandon. This continuity helps resolve puzzles that archaeology alone struggled to explain. Why Viking sites so often show continuity rather than destruction. Why settlements evolve instead of collapsing. Why cultural change appears swift, yet remarkably stable. The answer is not population replacement. It is transformation lived, domestic, and passed from one generation to the next. The genetic evidence reveals something subtle, but deeply transformative in how we understand the Viking world. Viking was not an ethnicity in the biological sense. It was not a bloodline passed intact from generation to generation. It was a role, one that could be learned, performed, and inherited culturally. To be Viking was to participate in a system built around seafaring skill, martial ability, trade, and loyalty to shared codes of behavior. It functioned as a profession, a network, and a way of life, all at once. Entry was not determined solely by ancestry, but by usefulness and commitment. If you could sail across open water, if you could fight when required, if you could trade, negotiate, and contribute to the enterprise, you belonged. Competence mattered more than origin. Loyalty mattered more than lineage. This explains the genetic diversity now visible in Viking burials across Europe. It explains why individuals with local, foreign, and mixed ancestry could occupy positions of status within Viking society. And it explains why the Viking world expanded so effectively without relying on mass migration. The reality that emerges is not a closed ethnic group, but a pragmatic and adaptable culture, one far more diverse and far more strategic than the legend has long allowed us to see. For centuries, historians told a story that felt complete and convincing. The Picts vanished, the Vikings replaced them, and a new population emerged where the old one had stood. It was a simple narrative, shaped by material remains and repeated until it hardened into fact. But simplicity can be misleading. The truth, as the evidence now suggests, is far stranger. The Picts did not disappear. They were not erased by violence or driven from the land. Instead, they transformed themselves so completely that the memory of who they had been faded from the historical record. Their survival did not take the form of resistance, but of adaptation. They learned the language of power. They adopted the customs that mattered. They raised children who belonged fully to a new identity. In doing so, they endured. This was not the failure of a people, it was a strategic success. By changing shape, they preserved continuity beneath the surface of cultural change. They remained present, influential, and rooted in the landscape, even as the name by which they were known disappeared. They did not vanish. They succeeded by becoming something else. So, were Scotland's Vikings truly Vikings? The answer is both simpler and more unsettling than tradition allows. Yes, they were Viking in culture, in social organization, and in political power. They lived by Norse law, sailed Norse ships, fought Norse wars, and were buried according to Norse rites. In every visible way that mattered to their world, they were Vikings. But many of them were not Scandinavian by blood. The Viking Age in Scotland was not a story of extinction, nor of a people swept aside and forgotten. It was a story of reinvention, of individuals and communities who recognized where power had shifted, learned its language, and chose to master it rather than resist it. They did not disappear. They adapted. In doing so, they reshaped history so effectively that later generations mistook transformation for replacement. What appeared to be conquest was often conversion. What looked like loss was, in fact, continuity under a new name. History did not forget these people. It misunderstood them. And only now, with evidence drawn from their own bones, can we finally see who they were not as legend, but as living, strategic human beings navigating a changing world. The deeper we look into the past, the more we learn that identity is rarely fixed. It is negotiated, performed, and remembered unevenly. If this story changed how you think about the Vikings, consider what other histories might still be hiding beneath familiar names, waiting, quietly, for the evidence to catch up.